All right. So today, Tony, I'm really excited to talk about our topic. You want to tell everybody what the topic is?
I mean, I can. This is one that you kind of took the charge on, so let me see if I understand it right. I guess today we're going into the exploring the what's the word I'm looking for? The trend that millennials have towards communism and socialistic tendencies. Obviously not probably full-blown communism, but everything's leaning way more that way. And we kind of want to dig in and see why that is, and healthy, not healthy, good, bad, ugly. Let's just kind of explore. I'm excited.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the problems that a lot of millennials are facing these days is that I feel like to combat this quote unquote rise of China that's happening, and we've got a whole nother episode on that topic specifically, but I almost feel like there's propaganda going on around America.
Feels that way, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. And so amidst all of these different issues that we're facing as a society, I feel personally like I don't know who to trust. Like, I've got my own preconceived notions.
Sure.
And I've got my own biases, just like we all do. And so growing up in America, you hear, well, communism's bad. And I really want to just explore that idea and really walk through this conversation with our audience. And hopefully we can uncover some interesting points that might be pro or anti-communism, pro or anti-capitalism, and not really do a compare contrast, but figure out what it is that's driving this trend, as you mentioned, that millennials are really setting their eyes on socialistic tendencies and policies.
Yeah, absolutely. And that whole not sure who to trust, I kind of feel like that's a big reason of why we're here in the first place, is a lot of these conversations that we found ourselves having is like, well, shit, man, I don't know what's real.
Right, absolutely.
So let's just explore every avenue and see what makes the most sense, or see what, kind of sticks, right? So yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah, 100% there with you. So obviously this isn't the most exciting next minute to come, but I do want to just ground our listeners in some of the terms that we're going to be talking about: communism, capitalism, socialism, and who millennials are, just so that we understand exactly what we're talking about and that we don't get lost in the nuance of what those words mean
sure.
to
Yeah, that's
one group
important.
versus another group. So when I reference millennials, this is just a Merriam-Webster dictionary definition. It's people belonging to the generation born in the 1980s or 1990s, and that refers to the millennials. Do you have any other thoughts there? Seems like it hits it pretty.
No, I mean, I guess it's just that age range. So how old are those people currently? So
yeah, so this is 2020. So at the high end, you're looking at 40.
Okay.
At the low end, you're looking at young 20s.
Okay.
So I
cool.
would say I'm 27, so I'm kind of towards the back end of what you might call millennials by this definition.
Cool. Yeah, because I mean, I'm lazy, so I knew I didn't want to do the math. So thanks for doing it for me. And then for anyone else who's like me and doesn't want to do the math, now you know. So hooray, definitions.
Sure, there we go. So you're, generally speaking, we'll say 25 to 40-year-olds today.
Perfect.
Kind of fits that bill. We'll start with capitalism, and then we'll dive into socialism and what those two mean. So
Let's do
capitalism, I'm just going to read the literal definition here. An economic system characterized by private or corporate ownership of capital goods, by investments that are determined by private decision, and by prices, production, and the distribution of goods that are determined mainly by competition in the free market.
All right, lazy me again. Talk to an idiot.
So we kind of threw a lot out there, right? That is a dense definition, certainly. So the way that I interpret this is, look, it's not products and services, generally speaking, under capitalism, don't get built and produced by a public entity. Meaning it's not everybody coming together and saying, hey, we need iPhones. Let's figure out how we can put our tax dollars, you might say, to work creating a system that creates iPhones. And so you can see that would expand into, just about anything. It might be Ubers and Lyfts. So public transportation might fall under a more socialistic category if you started trying to publicize that in its whole.
Yeah.
But under capitalism, we see the rise of like Uber, Lyft, and gig economy. We see private ownership of the companies that are producing the goods and services that we're talking about here. And then there's that underlying concept of competition, which in a capitalistic society, the capitalists would argue that's a good thing because it leads to more innovation, more goods and services. It's what led to the iPhone, if you use that example, or the internet, whatever you want to use as an example. They would attribute to the idea of competition. And then also, as a result of competition, it drives prices down, because as a business owner, I have to understand that I'm going to be competing with other people who might be producing the same goods and services. And well, if I want the public or my consumers to buy my product, well, one of the things that's going to incline a customer to choose my product over somebody else's is price or the innovation. Again, it goes back to that conversation about innovation.
Yeah. So it's basically like the opportunity, there's an incentive built into it, right? So that you can get more market share for your product and then in turn make more money. Whereas in a different system, that's what makes capitalism, that's its specialty or whatever. That's what makes it special, is that incentivization is built into it. Am I following along?
Yes, absolutely. Cool. But I do want to be cautious, because I want to take the approach that we explore the idea here that is that a benefit here? Because I think on the other side of the argument, you might hear people saying that that leads to greed, because you can collect all of the power and the wealth that gets attributed to some of these companies. Actually, this is kind of coming on the heels of a Congress hearing that we recently heard, where some of the major CEOs or owners of the top tech giants in America were called up to Congress to discuss some antitrust conversations. So we saw Microsoft, we saw Facebook, we saw Amazon, and I think Twitter was part of this, all represented at this congressional hearing, because they're really exploring this idea of like, are they becoming too powerful? We're hearing conversations about, did Facebook influence elections? Did Twitter influence elections? So there's really a lot to unpack here and dive into. But before we get too far down that path, let's dive into defining socialism and communism, which is actually, I learned, an extension of socialism. So it's almost like communism is socialism, but socialism is not necessarily communism.
So communism is a flavor of socialism.
Yeah. Yep. So let's hit those definitions. Socialism, any of various economic and political theories advocating collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. So right there, you hear it, the stark difference between capitalism and socialism, which is collective or governmental ownership of goods and the distribution of goods
versus private.
Right, exactly.
Got it.
So that's socialism. And so you can see, well, just due to your or my ignorant understanding of communism, well, communism fits that bill. It's public ownership of goods and services. Mm-hmm. So communism specifically is a system in which goods or services are owned in common and are available to all as needed. So I think that's the difference here between communism and socialism. This is what makes communism communism, is that all of these are available as needed, a theory advocating elimination of private property. So you might have this idea of the goods and services and the distribution channels. So the companies, I'll use air quotes to say companies.
Sure.
And the distribution of goods and services are collectively owned, but the goods themselves ultimately have private ownership. So let's think about that. We've mentioned that we're recording from Nashville. Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that rose out of the Great Depression era is the Tennessee Valley Authority. So for anybody that doesn't know what the TVA is, basically Eastern Tennessee has a lot of mountains and water and rivers, and we capitalized on that opportunity to create hydroelectric dams and things like that. And so that's all been subsidized by the government. So this is, the government is really just us. It's representative of the people. So there you have collective ownership of a utility company, essentially, is what that really boils down to.
Yeah, but I'm not getting dividends because I live here and I still pay my power bill. So tell me what that does. Like, why is that a good thing, bad thing? Like, what's the point of that?
Yeah, so the good thing is that we get subsidized power, so it makes it cheaper, more affordable, and I think a lot would argue that that's really important because that's how we live the modern lives that we live. It all comes down to power. But I was using that as an example of socialism, and to differentiate from that versus communism. Communism would mean that my house in and of itself, the power that it uses, would actually be the power for everybody as well. So if you think about like an electrical grid, if I only use X number of units of power, I wouldn't really have to pay into that because it's everybody's power source. And so what I think would happen here, and you may correct me if you have a different interpretation, but what would happen here is if it were communism, my house, I wouldn't get charged for how much power I use because the power in and of itself is being provided by everybody involved. And so I would just be, somehow they would have to pay for it. So really the answer is I would be taxed at a higher level than I am right now to help pay for the power that's being distributed to everybody. So it's not, right now, it's not that the entire power system is being funded by the government. It's just the production of the power is being funded by the government. And I still have to pay for the power that I use. But the dams and all of that, that's collective ownership.
Got it.
I think that's my understanding. And, I could be off on that. So it might be easier to understand if we look at like a specific good or something like that. You might have a market where everybody's got access to these different, we'll say, produce. And all that produce is available to everybody at essentially equal levels, because the definition of communism here is that goods are owned in common and are available to all as needed.
So the sound of that, like, what's the point of money then? If everything's just available as needed, it almost seems like, and this is, again, ignorant me, not ever living in a communist reality, money's not irrelevant, and whoever determines as needed, whatever that determination is, that's your new currency.
Yeah, it could be. And, honestly, I don't know the answer to that. So this is something that we might have to dive in a little bit deeper and really figure out how that functions, because obviously in China, you have the Chinese yuan as their currency, so they're paying for things. So there may be an arbiter that says everybody gets X number of dollars per month, perhaps. That might be where we start seeing universal basic income, which has become more of a mainstream topic. Andrew Yang, I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Yeah.
But
I thought he had a lot of really interesting thoughts.
He did, and he really backs it up. His position is more to combat automation and robots, or just engineering in general, taking away jobs. And so I think if anybody listens to Andrew Yang, I think he does an excellent job explaining the nuances and the benefits and the value of universal basic income. And perhaps we even land on that as the sole solution, or as part of a solution, so that we can really find like a good balance here. Is there an intermediary zone of capitalism and communism that works well? So, as we're talking about this, when we say communism, kind of makes you wonder, is China an actual communistic society?
I don't know. I've not studied China enough to really have an idea on that.
My hunch, I agree. I'm there with you. My hunch, though, is that it's not actually like by definition communism, but it's very heavily skewed in that direction. So just a couple examples of what's going on with China. In China, you have this environment where corporations are individually owned, meaning they have an owner, but it's not exactly privatized. So let me give you an example.
So based on these definitions, what you're explaining, it seems like a hybrid between capitalism and socialism, kind of like what you're leaning towards.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I would say that it's definitely more heavily skewed in the literal definition of communism. But
Sure.
as we're having this conversation, I don't think it's all the way there. I don't think it's truly a communistic society.
Cool.
And obviously that's represented because they have a leader, and he doesn't live in the exact same circumstances that everybody else does. And so I think I would almost say literally impossible to have a truly communistic society because, well, that would mean that everybody's living in San Diego where everybody wants to live, right? But that's not exactly the case.
Right.
You could even get to the point where you have the same house as everybody else in the country, but you're still not living in the same spot as everybody in the country.
Can you imagine that though? Like, wouldn't that just be so boring as hell? Like you're talking on the phone to your friend and they're like, oh, I got new furniture. And they're, oh, where is it? Oh, it's in room B, because everyone knows what the fuck room B is. And everyone has the exact same thing. Like,
yeah, you just have like a grid system.
I'm so torn thinking that if that would either be helpful or harmful for creativity. Like obviously in some aspects it'd be harmful for creativity. Like architects, what the fuck are you going to do? You're going to build the same box that everyone has that you've built 100,000 of. Like there goes your creativity. But sometimes a friend of mine told me that creativity likes to flourish in inside of a box, right? When you don't have anything to try to break out of or learn how to play inside of differently, it's hard to be creative and just come up with something out of nothing. But when you have a framework, sometimes that forces creativity because you're like, well, how do I do this differently within this space? So I think in some aspects it would help creativity, in other aspects it would kind of hurt. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think you're right. When you were saying that, you actually made me think of something, and that is patents. So
Ooh.
Think about that here in the capitalistic culture. We have to enforce patents because I can look at what you've created and say, oh, that just inspired me. So there's inspiration because I'm able to observe somebody else's creativity, and I could steal that for my own, or I could steal that idea and innovate on it and build something better. But if you take like a very literal definition of communism, which I don't think that we have any real world examples of.
Sure.
Then if every house were the same, I wouldn't be able to go drive down the road and be like, well, I want to see what they've done to their landscaping and then figure out if I like it or not. And then that's literally what I did whenever I was doing some landscaping earlier this year. I drove around and I was like, well, I don't really know what I like. I've never owned a house before. Like,
Right.
Who knows? I never had to pay attention to this. And here I am, like 25 years on Earth. And I'm like, yeah, I just took it for granted. Let me go see what other people are doing. And so that's what I did. But if everybody had the exact same landscaping or the exact same house, then I wouldn't be able to do that. It'd just be like, well, here's what I'm given. Now, on the flip side, though, you brought up the architect example. Maybe what would happen is there would be, first of all, fewer architects because it's not as in demand. But you might still, let's just arbitrarily pick a number. You might have 30 architects in the country. And together they came up with this just brilliant, perfectly designed house that works for everybody. And then it's just cookie cutter from there. Every contractor knows how to build that house. Every architect knows how to design that house, no matter where you're at. And then maybe there would be some more creativity that could stem from that because those architects would be free to design a different model that they think might be better or more aesthetically pleasing.
Okay, so let's go down that. They designed something better, and the country already has House A. That's been the standard for the last 10 years. In order to maintain everyone has the same stuff, if that's what the goal is, you now not only have to start building your new houses in Model B, but you have to go convert all of the A's to B.
I suppose you might also implement a system where a value is assigned. So House A has $100,000 value and House B has $100,000 value.
And then everyone's playing within that dollar amount to get what they want. Okay.
Right. And so that would probably be the realistic way to approach this.
That makes sense.
Yep. But again, then you're technically, I don't mean to get into all like the minutia of this, but you're technically getting away from communism because the same good isn't available to everybody. If you have half the houses as A and half the houses as B, but it turns out that 60% of your population likes A, well, then that means 10% of your population is not satisfied because they have to get House B because there are only so many House A's available.
Right. Yeah, I think we're probably looking too hard at one aspect of this and going, wait a minute. But it was still fun thought exercise.
I think so too. Yeah, it's interesting. And so let's circle back around to China specifically. I said that I would give an example. So Huawei is a major phone company, manufacturer, and it's a Chinese company. And what you see if you start looking at that is that there is an individual, and I think it's even like a family owns Huawei. And the deal is that the Chinese government is involved in Huawei's operations. So once you get to a certain threshold or have, let's say, pique the interest of the Chinese government, then they look at ways to combine their government system with that corporation. So then it becomes kind of publicly owned, you might say.
Makes sense. Even just a thought of that. And again, this is me not experiencing that firsthand ever, but man, I like to go do my own thing. And especially like when I'm creating or coming up with stuff, like let me go create it. Let me go ask for some feedback. But when someone sticks their nose and like tries to tell me how to do what I'm creating, that's a buzzkill, man.
Certainly.
Like, so I'm just trying to think of like, how is this good, right? Trying to have an open mind going, what are the pros of that? And I guess having, that, I guess, historical, knowledge and experience, right? To be able to come in and add that depth of something to, if it's just me as an individual, having my own company, creating my whatever, having somebody come in with that length of experience and probably resources and stuff too, there is probably some benefits to that. Now, it probably gets into a little bit of struggle when you can't say no.
Yeah, and so that's something that I actually don't know. So if somebody in the audience that's listening knows the answer to this, then I would love to go through and read some comments. So definitely post it on our social media. You want to give us a shameless plug on some of our social?
Why don't you keep talking and I'll pull it up.
Sounds good. This is one of our first few episodes, so we're getting everything launched still. But so my question here is, how did that happen? Did Huawei start off as, a 3-person company and then over the years grow into a major player in the cellular phone space? Or did it start off as a government initiative and the government says, hey, we're going to give this one person who is qualified for whatever reason, they've met some criteria, and we're going to subsidize them to create this company called Huawei. And so that's where you get that like private owner. He's technically the owner, but the government also is integrated so heavily. So I'm not really sure, is it the government helped bring Huawei to be this entity that it is, or was it Huawei started off small and grew and became successful and got pretty big on their own, similar to that of an American company, and then China steps in and says, hey, we could use your company to achieve our goals, like putting the Huawei 5G hotspots across the world. And so here in America, again, this makes sense to me, but I want to be sensitive of the reality that I really don't know this to be true. But one of the ideas here that I hear in the States is that China has an ulterior motive, that if they own all of the 5G hotspots, and by own, I mean Huawei owns them, but you see where this is going. Then they can monitor the traffic that's being communicated across those 5G hotspots. And so the US feels that this is a security threat because, well, all of our military communications are going to be based on that infrastructure that the Chinese government is implementing across the world, right?
Makes sense.
And then the benefit for China is that because they can subsidize this, Huawei doesn't have to bear the entire cost burden of producing millions or billions or whatever it takes to create all of these 5G hotspots to put them around the world. So now they're cheaper, meaning if you're Ericsson or Nokia or let's say even Verizon or AT&T or some of the cell carriers here, well, that's hard to compete with because Huawei has cheaper prices than what some of these other capitalist-based companies
because
can pay for.
They're not needing an immediate profit to pay the people for their efforts like we do here in a capitalistic way.
Right. Yep. So, Verizon can only implement 1 billion 5G hotspots if they can pay for it. And more specifically, if they can recoup the cost.
Right.
Because sure, they might be able to use all of their capital that they have currently to pay for that. And maybe they could afford that, but would they be able to get their money back? And then you see that they might exhaust all of their capital and they would go out of business ultimately. Everybody's got 5G hotspots, but hey, Verizon can't afford to maintain them anymore.
Yeah.
Very hypothetical.
Of course.
Theoretical example.
But it makes sense because as opposed to it widens your pool for resources, which again, taking out agenda and intention out of it seems like it could be a pretty symbiotic relationship.
What could be? What's it?
That like what you just described, the having cheaper products and being able to not have to pay for everything out of pocket as an individual entity. Now you've got the government with much bigger pockets and a bigger pool of resources to help achieve your goals. But I think in turn, you also have to start achieving their goals as well. Just like you enter it with a partnership for anything else, meaning the government's goals.
Oh, the government's goals. Right. Sure. Exactly. Because, they've got a reason for being involved and integrated with the corporation. And then here's the other thing to consider, though, is yes, that the government has the money and can fund that and subsidize, we'll use this example again, Huawei's 5G network. But the government doesn't actually have money. The people have money. So that's where you have to really kind of dive into the economics of this. So I want to be clear that communism and capitalism can get very complex because it takes a lot to understand and unravel all of this. Because basically what's happening in theory, and I don't know that this is actually the case in China. Again, I want to be very cautious of this. But in theory, what I suspect is happening is the Chinese government is subsidizing Huawei, but where does the government get that money? Well, they have to go and tax their people, or they have to ultimately get the wealth to transfer to Huawei as the company. Again, might not even be transfer the wealth to the sole owner, because if it's a real communistic society, then that sole owner wouldn't actually get the money. But
so let me check and see if I get this right. Yeah. So basically, hypothetically, let's say everyone gets taxed at 50%, and that 50% tax way more than we get taxed here, right? Like 50% off of every check, right? Not talking like profit taxes and corporation, all that, but like 50%, maybe it's even higher, 80%, right? And that all goes into helping expand these bigger things and making everything so much more cheaper. So that way that 80% that's taxed out, you get in 80% discount in everything that you get. Am I basically following along hypothetically?
Yeah, hypothetically, it might not be a 1-to-1 ratio where
But
you
I'm
get
following.
an 80% discount, but yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Because basically what the government does in that situation, again, from my understanding, is that they are just the arbiter of transferring finances, wealth, money, right? So they collect all of the wealth and then distribute where they see fit.
In ways that are at least hypothetically beneficial for the entire community.
Well, you would hope. Not even hypothetically.
In theory, it probably doesn't roll out that way because people with power insulate themselves, but theoretically, on paper, that's how it's supposed to work.
Right. And then so I think herein lies my opinion on this, and I'll just be really upfront with what my opinion is. And again, I want to be cautious that, you know, I grew up in America, and so I've heard the capitalistic rhetoric all my life.
And boo commies and blah, blah, blah. Like,
Right,
yeah, I get it.
But, you know, as we walked through this, I came to the same conclusion, which is that I don't want the government deciding what's best for me or what's best for my city or what's best for the country as a whole. Like, I just have this poor view of how the government handles things.
Yeah. Again, maybe because we're in America and
yeah, and so this could very much be a subjective topic.
Sure.
Not that it could be, it is a subjective topic. And you have to understand that people have different experiences. And so maybe the Scandinavian countries who have, you know, just awesome, super high ratings of happiness. I don't know if you've ever looked at some of those studies.
I have. I really love their prison stuff that they do.
Tell me about it. I don't know.
Again, I'm not sure on which exact country this was, but in that space over there where they've got that high happiness, they send them not to like iron bars, solitary punishment type stuff. They send them out in the woods with like responsibilities far away enough removed from civilization. And hey, you screwed up. You got to live out here in the middle of nowhere. And here's the stuff you got to do. And if you don't do it, you'll die.
Holy shit.
Like, you got to do this to survive.
Wow.
And it kind of puts you in timeout, but puts you in timeout with a purpose. Because I'm out here, I'm still a human, I'm still gathering my food, taking care of myself, taking care of my shelter. And then every, I don't know, X amount of time, I mean, there's like a guard or someone stationed out there with them, but then they have people come out and check on them. And if they run away, cool, we'll chase you down and then we'll put you in real jail. But the idea is
it's like a second chance.
It's a second chance, and it's intentionally focused on rehabilitation. Like, hey, you screwed up. Let's put you in timeout back here. Let's dig into why and make sure that we can make sure you're ready to come back to hang out with all the rest of everyone else. And it's meant to keep people out of that system, as opposed to our system, which is intended to, and like the privatizedness, like people are incentivized to keep the prisons full, which I don't think is the greatest thing for society, because we're incentivized to make more criminals, or at least to peg people as criminals.
Hey, while we're on that, let's make that one of our future episodes. Privatized prison system.
Yeah, I'd love
to dive into that.
Love to have a conversation about that. You writing that down?
Yep.
All right, awesome.
So
stay tuned for in the future, privatized prison systems.
Yeah, I love that. And I'd love to just really figure out what the actual impacts are here, but I can only imagine that it's just a terrible, terrible
I'm so excited
system.
to dig into that. Coming back to this one, though, because I don't want to get too far off. Steal the thunder of the future.
Right. So yeah, we'll definitely explore that. But yeah, so you can see that the idea here is that capitalism puts the transfer of wealth in the hands of individuals, and communism or socialism puts the transfer of wealth in the government.
That was a really long 45-minute discussion on defining two words. I love it.
Are we at 45 minutes?
I think we're around there.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So we've defined it.
Success. All right, now let's talk about it. We made it there. We defined communism, capitalism, and millennials. We defined that too.
We did.
25 to 40. I remember. Do I get a thing for the quiz?
Yeah. Is there gonna be a quiz at the end?
I want my gold star.
So yeah. So let's come full circle here and say, why is it that millennials in the U.S.
Yeah.
And I think that this bleeds over into a lot of European millennials as well,
Sure.
have ideologies that are skewing towards socialism or communism entirely. And so, I thought about this one for a while, and I don't think that there is just like an answer. I don't think that there's a blanket statement that anybody's going to come up with. But I do think that if you had to sum it up into one blanket answer, it would be something to the effect of millennials feel like capitalism is failing them, and therefore they want to look at
Other
an
options.
alternative.
Yeah.
Right.
So why, I know we're probably going to get into this, but why is it failing them? Well, like why is that? Why are millennials feeling that capitalism has missed a buck?
Yeah. So part of it may be undue blame on capitalism. And what I mean by that is I want to look at the 2008 crisis here, when the housing market collapsed. What ultimately happened was the government spent, it was $700 or $800 billion bailing out these banks, these major banks that had made poor investments in the housing market and with these loans, knowing that they were very sketchy loans and likely to fail, but because they could profit on it, they still made those decisions. And so I'm not going to get into the details because it's not my area of expertise, but there is a documentary called The Inside Job, and it does a great job of explaining what happened. They have their own bias. So again, I caution anybody who goes to watch that to understand that they have a bias.
I saw something on that. I think it was one of the episodes, Dirty Money, had an episode on all of that. And it's super interesting to go. What I pulled away out of it was that they made a lot of dumb choices trying to either make growth or give the illusion of growth to try to like push up that shareholder stuff. And it was all like short-term thinking instead of long-term thinking. If you would have asked anybody if they'd have been critical about it, hey, is this sustainable? Easy answer, no.
Right.
But nobody cared because they wanted the bonus. They wanted the numbers to move so they could get their bonus and make people happy that year.
And so then you almost see an incentive to do things like that under this capitalism model.
Yeah.
Because these individuals can go out and try to get as much wealth as they can possibly get, and it can incentivize them to do some sketchy and under the table things that aren't good for everybody.
Well, I think part of the issue is that Simon Sinek talked about it in his book, The Infinite Game, on how in the 1970s, I can't remember the guy's name, but it was an economist at the time, came out and changed the perspective of capitalism. Up until that time, CEOs, or changed the perspective of what the CEO's responsibility was. And at the time, the CEO's responsibility was more like making sure the business was successful, taking care of the employees, taking care of the customers. Like it was almost this like true leadership figure, in my opinion. This guy changed the perspective and said, he introduced the idea of the shareholders being the CEO's responsibility. So instead of taking care of the employees, taking care of the customers, now it's, I have to do whatever it takes to make the shareholders happy, to make the shareholders make more money at the end of the year. So now it introduced...
And I'm sorry to interrupt
go
you,
for it.
but the idea there is that if you don't make the shareholders happy, then they pull their money out of the investment in your company and transfer their investment into somewhere else where they can make money as shareholders.
Sure, hypothetically, yeah. And so that's, prior to then, all these crazy things like layoffs were never common practice. Nobody ever laid people off. They buckled up and made sure that people banded together and found a way to take care of it. But because it was trying to make sure the company was healthy and sustainable long term. Now it's, hey, how do we cut something to make a buck and make the shareholders happy? Well, if you keep cutting off your appendages, eventually you're not going to have anything left. And then things like the 2008 crisis happened. And, even earlier in the 2000s when the dot-com bubble burst. And now here again, when we have this pandemic, like all of these things, we're not learning from it and going, I don't think capitalism is bad. I think our approach to capitalism is bad, and thinking all of this short-term thinking, and we've traded the long-term thinking because we don't want to wait to make the money and the sustainability long-term.
Right. Yep. And I wonder what the root of that is. Why do we go for the short-term reward instead of the long-term? Does it have to do with our political system, and that everybody has 4 years to solve these problems and then earn somebody's votes again?
It's bigger than that. We're used to McDonald's, man. We're used to the internet. Like before, when you had a question and you wanted something to know, one, you had to either have a set of encyclopedias or go to your friend's house that had a set of encyclopedias and then dig through all the pages and find some answer. Now we carry around, like on our phones, the access to so much information all the time. With the access to so much shit all the time, we expect it so quickly. So, man, I'm hungry. Cool, food right now. It opens up to all these different problems in so many different ways. Like you've got obesity because people are overeating because they don't have to take the time to think about, well, I'm crafting my own food and what do I have to make in it and what's healthy and
do I even have to go catch it and hunt it like we used to do?
Like, no, I don't even have to leave my house anymore. I just roll up on my phone again and be like, food come to me. And it comes, so I think it's culturally, and I think little bit by little bit, it started off as a value add for people, or, let's be nice to people. Let's create a service for them. Let's get their stuff quickly. Let's get it done. Oh, let's just deliver stuff to people, not understanding the other implications of it. And now am I trying to say like we need to get rid of technology and we need to like stop fast food? Like, nah, everything has its place, right? But how do we balance it and fix the problems these solutions have created?
Like it's evolving faster than we are.
Yeah.
Right.
100%.
So let's go back to your question, which is why do millennials feel like capitalism is failing them?
Right.
And we were talking about the 2008 crisis and where we had a $700 or $800 billion bailout. What ultimately happened there is that went and bailed out those banks that made bad decisions. And what happened was any government spending is ultimately a taxation in some form or fashion, whether they have to tax the populace to get the funds, to get that $800 billion, or whether they just create $800 billion, which inevitably leads to a quote unquote tax called inflation.
Right.
The value of your dollar went down. So either way, the populace gets the short end of the stick there. And what happens is that those people that were leading the executive teams of these big banks got that money, basically the populace's money, and they were able to survive that crisis. And under the guise of this is good because if those banks go down, then nobody will be able to get a loan, et cetera, et cetera.
So in essence, they got rewarded for doing shitty things.
They got rewarded. They got the money to stay in business. And I want to be very clear, because if we look at the definition of capitalism, that is not capitalism. If the government is giving you money to stay in business, then that is not very different than the Chinese government giving Huawei money to go build a 5G network. And so here's my position on this, and it's that we see what happens in those situations, and we don't think about it as not being capitalism. We think that we are a capitalistic society, a capitalistic country, and for the large part we are. But when you look at that specific issue, that wasn't an example of capitalism. So to anybody that doesn't go down that thought process, which took us an hour to do, so I don't expect everybody to do that. So to anybody that doesn't go down that thought process, they're going to come to the conclusion, understandably so, that capitalism has failed them. These big banks got to do some really shitty things to the general population. Those few individuals ultimately got all of me representing the populace, all of my money, and now they can continue doing all of those practices.
Yeah, that's kind of nuts, man.
So that's ultimately, in my mind, a failure of us to understand the definition there.
Yeah.
And we're blaming the wrong model.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. What else do you think causes or has caused that millennial generation to feel like capitalism has failed them? I think we talked a little bit about beforehand the cost of tuition.
Yeah.
Like how much that's increased. So I think a big part of it is that, our parents, the generation before us, was told, and it was right. Like the path was go to college, learn how to do something valuable, and then get the money to pay off the little bit you've paid for college, and you're golden. And so I think a lot of us have followed that path, and then we're sitting here with all this debt, and then not necessarily the same reality that our parents have had following the same path. So I think that also leads to the same, hey, capitalism doesn't work anymore.
Yeah. So this is something that I didn't think of until literally just now, but that might be another example of us blaming capitalism where it wasn't an example of capitalism. Right. So let's look at college tuition, and there's no doubt that it's been rising. And some of that might be due to matching inflation.
Sure.
If there is inflation, then the price of goods and services is also going to increase relative to that inflation. So if the value of your dollar drops by 4%, so now it's only worth 96 cents. Well, it's not like that that good got any cheaper necessarily. So what happens is now I have to spend $1.04 to buy that same product.
Right.
Well, let's take that in mind with tuition and understand that some of this could be related to inflation, but I think that some of it is also tied up in, again, government subsidizing student loans. So
explain that.
Back in, it was 1965, the government started federally backing, guaranteeing loans. So if Nick, me, goes, so if I go to a school and say, hey, I'd like to enroll in your university.
Yeah.
And they say, great, our tuition is $10,000 a year. And I say, I don't have $10,000 a year, which I probably don't because I just got out of high school, more than likely. Then I am guaranteed to get a loan to cover my college. And that loan is backed by the government.
And what are the implications of that?
So what happens in theory is if you're a university which behaves as a business and ultimately is a very bureaucratic business.
I see where this is going. Hey, the government's guaranteeing whatever price I put. Let's jack up my prices and make a fuck ton more money because I can. They're guaranteeing to pay for this, so who cares?
Right, exactly. And so again, it's a hypothesis. I'm not sure that this is true.
But at least gives possibility for that to be the reality in at least some places.
Right. And then so again, if we're looking at the tuition prices and we're like, well, they're going through the roof. I mean, in my personal situation, it did not make sense for me to go finish a 4-year degree right after high school. One, because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And two, because my parents weren't exactly in a position to pay for me to go to school. So I was going to have to incur that debt. And I told you earlier this evening, I was like, you know what? I might be happy being a dump truck driver. And I don't need a college degree to do that. And I really don't need the debt that comes along with my situation in trying to get that degree, right?
Right.
And so I think what happens is you have that narrative that you brought up, which is that, hey, you know, back in my day,
here's the path to success. And
you go get your degree.
You're a dumb kid. You don't know anything else. Okay, cool. This is what success looks like, mom and dad. Anyone else who tells me cool, let's go do this. I'm going to college. I don't even know what I'm going for. You know how many people I talk to that went to college or are in college in the first couple. I don't know. I'm here. This is what I'm supposed to do. So you're getting, tens of thousands or hundreds of $1,000s worth of debt.
Yeah, tens is conservative.
Yeah, just to check the box of what you're told, what society tells you success looks like. And then it's not paying off. Like I was sold something and it's not delivering.
Right. Yes. Or it might be delivering, but you're so far in the hole that you don't start reaping the rewards until you're 35,
40.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so anybody who's in that situation, hey, we just talked about 35, 40. So who is that? That's our millennials, right?
Who should be at that spot where now they're on top of their game, buying their houses, like really off into their careers and like tasting the fruit of their labor, like their parents were when they started on this journey. And they're like, what the fuck? I'm not where they said I would be. And it's not that I'm off by a little bit. Like I am so far removed. And not just me. It's not just I had an off story, but a generation for the most part.
Still living with their parents.
Yup.
And so you can start seeing how this bleeds over. Like living with your parents wasn't a conversation about tuition, but ultimately that could be a huge contributor to that.
Yep, absolutely.
Among many other variables that can come into play here. And then while we're talking about the tuition, when tuition prices were low, well, what could you do if you didn't want to get into debt? If you were a really productive person and really just put your boots on, got them nice and tight every morning and went out and conquered the world, well, you would go get a job during the summer, and your minimum wage job, or maybe you're just above minimum wage, whatever it is.
Basic labor, whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. You were able to, break even, or maybe get a couple $100 a month that you could spend on food and a little bit of fun. But, you sacrificed all those hours working in the summers so that you didn't come out with $80,000 in debt.
Right. 100%. Dude, I know we talked about this a little bit. I love, because we were just talking about tuition going crazy. Today, I saw that Google put out that thing about putting out their equivalent of like college degrees that they're going to do, like certification programs. So that's what they're calling them. They said it'll take them about 6 months to complete. And at least internally, they're going to look at if you've completed that certification as the equivalent of a 4-year degree. And the cost, $300.
So check this out. I love that you brought that up, because when you first sent me that, I haven't had a chance to read it yet.
Yeah.
Let me just real quick before we get into the conversation here, let me read a paragraph that I have not read yet. So hopefully this does a good job of explaining it. But it says the company, based in Mountain View, California, says the certificates are the equivalent to a 4-year degree with offerings such as data analytics, project management, and user experience design, so UX design. They will also be taught by Google employees themselves. Google also said that the tuition for these certificates would be remarkably affordable compared to a traditional 4-year university, which averages approximately $18,000 for public universities. So, I'm really excited to see where this goes. And ultimately, what is a degree? It's a way for companies to look at a certificate, is ultimately what it is.
You've got this knowledge.
That says you've got this knowledge. And as a hirer, somebody looking to hire people, I can trust that that university taught somebody well enough so that they will be qualified to just drop into my job and go. That's the idea there. And so that's why you see a school like Harvard can charge more, because the general understanding is that Harvard educates their students.
It's a brand, yeah.
Better. Exactly. It's a brand. And so all of this really stems to universities and schools are run as a business, right? So Google is being a little bit targeted here as we read the roles. They're using this to say, hey, if you complete this, then I know that you're good enough to be hired at Google.
Which is prestigious enough.
Right. And so I would assume that other companies, particularly tech companies, might also adopt that and say, hey, if you graduated Google's
Well,
school,
think about
then
that
you're
for
good.
career pathing, right? Instead of going, hey, I need to go $100,000 in debt to go to a prestigious place like Harvard, Yale, whatever, I can spend my, and if it actually comes out to be 300 or whatever, it's still going to be cheaper than all of these and less time, my $300 at Google. And guess what? I'm probably going to be on a short list to get hired at Google if I went through their 6-month training program already. Guess what? Now I'm off the races 6 months in, right out of, quote unquote college. And now I'm off at Google making great money. And then you're there, you sit there for a couple of years, boom, now you're set. I've worked at Google. I can go anywhere.
Right. 100%.
Career trajectory done. And that you're not in the hole, that 100 grand, and you have an extra 3.5 years making money. So like just numbers alone, this is fantastic. And I'm curious to see, this is fresh. I just saw it today. As it becomes an option, and I'm curious to see if the rest of the like job industry recognizes what Google has done as the equivalent of a 4-year degree, just like Google has, and to see if they follow suit. And then obviously the education industry is going to have to shift, because if Google can do it in, a fraction of the time for a fraction of the cost, we're going to go out of business. Sure, there's other things they have to learn, but a lot of it's going to have to shift.
So let's tie that back into the actual subject here, which is millennials and communism.
Yeah.
So
is that a potential solution?
Well, I think it's absolutely a solution to the tuition issue.
Sure.
My question is, would that have ever evolved and developed in a communistic culture? So think about it this way. Let's think about colleges and universities as tied in with the government, as
Right.
we just explained earlier, that they very much are. They're state funded, they're regulated by the government, etc. Well, the government isn't ever going to try to inspire a different ideology here like Google's done, because to them, they're like, we got a system that educates people. It might be broken as hell, but there's no incentive for the government to innovate and come up with a different solution. So here we see capitalism at play. Google says, why the hell are you going to go into this massive amount of debt just to get the same education that you could get from Google's certificate program? And then, as you mentioned, by the way, maybe you get shortlisted and you get hired on at Google, or you're more likely to. And so that's competition in and of itself. So we see a benefit there of the capitalism model, because Google's incentivizing people and competing with the college program.
Yeah, it seems like, and again, obviously I'm closer to capitalism because that's been more my experience, but it seems like it's built to allow for corrections, right? We've gone too far. And so someone else comes up with a solution that's cheaper, more time efficient. Naturally, the market's just going to move that way.
It's a shame that it took this long.
I wholeheartedly agree. But what does that similar process look like in the realm of communism? How, and I guess from firsthand experience, not having that, I don't know. But what does it look like if something has gone skewed too far or gets too broken? What does it look like to shift it? And how does that happen, either organically or by force?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And ultimately what it does is, I think it comes down to the trust in the leaders of the country.
Sure.
And you have to use air quotes with leaders in communism, because everybody's supposed to be equal, right?
Right.
But those who do have power over others ultimately do have power over others. And if your power might be the power to cut somebody's hair one way, but somebody else's power might be to enact policy a different way. And it's like, are those powers
Equal?
Yeah.
No.
I think you see where this is going. But anyway, if you have a good political system where the people who are in power are actually looking after the best interest of others, then I think you could see a situation where they inherently look at the policies that are in place, like maybe their tuition is getting out of hand, and they're like, yeah, we need to do something about this. And they actually do come up with a solution. So if you trust that the leaders can and will do that, then I don't see a problem there.
So it has to. So basically, in that, to answer my question, it has to come through the government or the leadership to enact that change, because there's not freedom to organically shift it like there is in capitalism.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
So it's still the opportunity for a solution is still there. It just works differently. Mm-hmm. Cool.
And it might be instigated differently too,
Yeah.
because here we're talking. I think corruption of power is almost an inevitability. I think we see it everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere, regardless of what system you're in. You know,
I can't think of one system that doesn't have to manage corruption. And so when you think about it that way, I don't want to trust the government to come up with solutions for me,
sure.
because I don't think that they will. And so what I think you might see in a communistic society is that to instigate change, you might have to see protests or real strong public outcry. And we see that here in the United States too.
Yeah.
Again, well, let's look at the recent protests. They're protesting exactly what we were just talking about, the groups of people that have the ability to hold power over others, the law enforcement.
Right.
And so they're protesting against that because it's an unjust, or the protesters view it as an unjust system. And I think we've all seen the specific incidents, and
Right.
I think it's pretty obvious that there's
Room for
some
improvement.
opportunity here to make this a better system. Exactly. So yeah, you see that like it's got to become a very loud vocal group to start change in a communistic society, just like it does here too. Or the government has to do something about it, but there wouldn't be that individual that could do something
And just shift it all on their own.
right.
Yeah.
And so Google, you might argue, is acting selfishly here, because
100%.
to them, they're like, well, shit, I'm just going to get all the people that I don't want to say this because it isn't necessarily true, but they might be thinking, these are all the people smart enough to realize that the college system is broken. So I'm already starting at a good spot. And then on top of that, they're going through my controlled training that puts them specifically in a position to drop and go in my company. And so I'm going to have the best people, and everybody else in Silicon Valley is going to have whatever the
Whatever's
public
left.
system
Yeah.
produces.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fantastic. I think it's genius. And I think them just being the first one, you're going to see everyone try to come up with their own program now. They're going to have to. And I'm curious because I know that Google has been intentional about, hey, the shit we're going to do is going to be broad enough. And I'm sure it's going to be Google specific, but I think they're going to be intentional to to transfer a skill set that will work outside of Google. Just in case, hey, you know what? You still getting your money's worth. You still have a good idea of, or a good image of our brand, even if we didn't hire you, but you still have our certificate and that still holds value elsewhere. So it's important that that isn't just an internal funnel. And so I think if I'm going to guess at the future, I'm going to guess that other companies are going to try to follow suit. And then the pitfall that they might fall into is that they're going to make it very Apple centric or whatever company. And it's going to be, oh, this is just how you get in here, not here's a skill set that you can use anywhere.
Right. And so that's definitely a risk. And so again, this is where, well, if you're the government, you have to start looking at that and being like, well, do I need to regulate this?
Sure.
And I mean, you can go down that conversation. That's a whole nother conversation to be had, is like, yes, do you regulate it? No, do you not regulate it? And that's not my area of expertise by any means.
Me either.
So I don't want to get into that conversation, but you can see that, like, yeah, it might not be for the best. But let's say that 3 or 4 companies start doing what Google's doing.
Yeah.
They're going to have to be pretty big companies to create this. So that's the reason I bring that up is
so you got probably like Amazon and Apple are the 2 that I think of.
Yeah, I think you could be significantly smaller than $1 trillion company and still do something like this.
Well, I'm just thinking on par with Google, right? Who are our competitors?
And Facebook.
Yep.
And so big tech basically is who we're talking about here. So let's say that 4 or 5, maybe 20 or 30 different companies do something similar. Well, now they have to start competing for me, the consumer, to to make me choose their program over somebody else's, because that might be like, well, now I'm looking at Google as a company and what it's like to work there, and I'm looking at Facebook and what it's like to work at that company. And if I like Google, I think they treat their employees better, I think they give better pay, then I'm going to choose their education program over Facebook's.
Yeah.
And so this is where I think...
But isn't that all healthy though? Because it...
Yes.
Okay.
That was going to be my point. I think that this is where you start seeing people like saying that big conglomerations are bad, and they definitely have some bad qualities.
And they certainly can be, yeah.
But you also see that the only way that they can get there that I can see is ultimately by producing something that I want, because I can voluntarily choose where to put my dollars and which businesses to support.
Yeah.
That also opens up the conversation about, well, like if you have a monopoly, like let's look at oil, which is a need. And that, like, a monopoly over a need is a problem.
Yeah.
Like, how do we approach that? I don't know the answer to this. And this might be where capitalism starts to fall apart.
Because at some point, I mean, the idea or the incentivization of capitalism is that the harder you work, the longer you work, the smarter you work, whatever, there's more rewards for you. There's always a bigger plateau to climb. And then if a ceiling gets put on a certain industry, like oil, let's say, hey, you can only have X amount of share. Well, guess what? No, I hit my 50% or whatever that number we decide is. I have no more incentivization. Everything that helped me build here, oh, cool, we'll just maintain. Well, guess what? Now my customer base, I'm going to treat like shit. Cough, cough, Comcast, right?
Yeah,
like
certainly.
It's exactly what we experienced with Comcast. Well, you know what? I'm sorry you're having a bad experience, but I don't care, because where else are you going to go? My exact reality. I can't get internet through anyone else, and I hate Comcast.
I own the shit in the ground. Like,
yeah,
some other company. So that's where, like, you don't have an opportunity to rise if you're a small company, because it's like, well, damn, I've got to compete with Comcast, and that means that I've got to run all of these.
And they already have the infrastructure. Yep.
Now, maybe, and I don't know the history of that industry, but I think AT&T built most of the infrastructure there. And so you'll see like Comcast, maybe, speaking out of my ass a little bit, but
okay.
I think Comcast might be renting the rights to use those lines that AT&T has already laid.
I would love that, because, I mean, again, personal experience, I don't have any affiliation with AT&T Comcast, but I love AT&T better. I've had a better experience the couple of places I've lived. I can get AT&T to my apartment currently, but it's only like super shit, basically dial-up service. To get anything usable to stream what we all use the internet for, you know, Netflix, gaming, looking up something on the internet and not hearing crazy loud noises, you have to have decent speed.
Right.
Well, in order to get that, sure, technically I think it checks the box of, oh, look, it's not a monopoly, you can get AT&T. Yeah, but it's not a comparable service. So it is still a monopoly, even though it's technically not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that's an interesting distinction, is that like you have to understand that there are other options, but it's like, which one's the viable option?
Right.
And so there's some nuance there inherently. Now, on the flip side, you might argue that, well, some company, whoever it was, had to make the investment to bury all the lines. And so they saw an opportunity. So let's take it back to the very beginning. All right. Like, it all stems from the telephone lines, which is why I think AT&T was one of the big ones that really first got to market here. But yeah, let's just say that telephone lines hadn't already been run and we've got internet, or this new idea of internet. So if you're a company and you're like, hey, I hear that these people are doing some cool internet stuff. I have an idea. What if we connected not just those two people's computer, which is how the internet started. It was one computer to another computer.
Right.
What if instead it was this whole web of everybody's computers? And then some investors say, hey, you know what? I think you got a pretty dope idea, dude. I'm going to, as the investor, put some money in trust with you that you're going to handle laying all the lines, and guess what? Now you have a viable company, and I, the investor, get a nice return on my investment.
Right.
And so there's mutual benefit there. And then the consumers get what? They get the internet.
They get access to the service. Mm-hmm.
So that's brilliant. It inherently was beneficial to everybody.
Yeah.
And if you don't like the internet or you don't use the internet,
You don't have to.
you don't have to pay for it.
Yeah, but I think how internet started versus how internet is, when it started, it wasn't a need, it was a luxury. Now it's almost a need. Mm-hmm. Like it's not quite a need, but it's almost a need. Like if you're wanting to, access most versions of community, it's all digital or has a digital aspect to it. So many job opportunities now are work at home. So in order to provide food for myself and a place to live, like internet's a need.
Right.
So I think being
And
in
to be
that,
competitive with others.
right. So now we're in that zone where monopolizing a need gets into that like sketchy space.
Right. Yes. And so like, I don't know what the answer is. So maybe we can just explore that. So let's use oil because that's about as close to a need as I think it gets in today's world.
Yeah.
And I say that because, well, it takes oil to get the power in your house. It takes oil to get your car going so that you can get to a job or so that you can farm or accomplish a task,
Or even just transportation stuff. Like it takes oil to get shit delivered to you on Amazon, even if you never leave your house. To get stuff at the grocery store that you can just go pick up. Like oil's absolutely a need.
Right. So let's say that a company gets control of the entire oil supply. Then they can charge whatever price they want, and they own the entire supply. So you might see the price of gas go through the roof. And I think people will start protesting that, and you might see a lot of pressure on the government to get involved and do something about it. But on the flip side, you might also see somebody like Elon Musk saying, hey, well, guess what? Everybody hates these gas prices, and now I've got a huge incentive to go make something that competes with oil. So maybe
To
you
create the
find
solution.
a green energy source. Maybe you don't.
Yeah, so I think what you're getting at is that some of these monopolies are harmful if they are not resolved, but the tension or the problem can actually create a really great environment for a solution to be created. Because if there's not a need and people aren't feeling squeezed by oil, and if you take out the environmental effects, off the table and off of the conversation, there's no incentive whatsoever.
Right.
To look for anything else. But now if it's monopolized and it's becoming too much of a strain, people are like, I need to find a solution elsewhere. And the longer that tension lasts, the quicker people are going to jump to a solution when it's available. So that's an interesting view on this. So even these monopolies and stuff that are bad, unhealthy might be a better word, actually create opportunity for solutions. That's interesting. I did not expect to see that.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thought experiment. I wonder what happens. Let's do the same thing with food. I don't know where this is going to go, but
Yeah.
While we said oil is a need, let's say inherently it's not a need. You don't need oil to literally survive.
Yeah.
So let's say that there's a monopoly on food. Then what?
On all food, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think on something with food, depending on how insane the people who ran the monopoly would be kind of the result in my hypothetical expectation. Because if it's strained enough, but that people can still survive, but there's still strain and tension, I think that allows for solution. Now, if it's strained enough that people start dying, that doesn't give room for creative solutions because now that's desperation.
Yeah, so I want to be cautious here because I don't think let's say that there is one owner of the world's food supply.
Right.
Obviously very hypothetical, but this is the thought experiment here. So that one owner is going to be incentivized to not let people die because that means that fewer people are purchasing the food.
It's a great call.
So ultimately, I think you would be capped at the highest price that the average or the majority of people could afford to pay. And so that would be like your cap. Kind of like a disease can only kill so many people before, hey, you killed everybody and the disease can't go on.
Yeah.
That's a high price to pay, a huge experiment to undergo. But
yeah, so let's go there, right? So someone is in charge of all the food and they've, you know, because people are smart and could figure it out. What's the most we can milk out of these people and put it right at that threshold? And how would you fix that? Like, what would a solution out of that look like?
Well, I didn't know what the solution was when we first started this.
Okay.
For me personally, though, because of this COVID stuff, I started learning to grow my own food.
Sure. Yeah, I bet a lot of people would probably start creating their own instead of having to. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Now, if they own the seed supply also, well, you know, ultimately what it might do is give rise to a black market. So they own the seed supply. Nobody can get seeds to even start growing their own food, but there is nature around, and the people that maybe I own a plot of land in the Amazon or something, or maybe I own a plot of land in Kansas, and I can say like, hey, you know what? I got a few corn kernels here. I'm going to start here. And then they can start selling those kernels of corn, the seeds, for a premium also.
Yeah, it makes sense
eventually
that the black market thing would be the answer. Because if people are getting milked, hey, you know what? I don't want to go here. I can't afford to get the variety of things I used to be able to because I'm now strapped. Guess what? That variety is going to be what's going to show up in the black market, and people are going to go there for that diversity, which is just another solution or another opportunity, even if it's not public and sanctioned.
Right.
If that makes sense.
And so that's going to take time to evolve, though.
Sure.
And just like what we talked about with this Google University, it took a long time for anybody to start competing with the college system. And I would argue that that's exactly what Google's doing.
Yeah.
And maybe somebody else is. You might argue that some of the the term just slipped my mind. But, you know, if you're like a plumber.
Like trade schools.
Trade schools, thank you. You know, that might be one competitor against universities, but the general narrative is, hey, you got to get a 4-year degree.
Got to get a real degree.
But I'll tell you what, I paid my plumber a shit ton.
Yeah.
So
puns.
Yeah, I didn't even catch that. Well done, sir. Well
That's
done.
Funny.
So
I know we went on a weird rabbit hole. You know, coming back to our topic on like millennials and having that lean to communism. I know some of the things that we had kind of listed here was, we had this conversation a couple days ago. What was it about the timing of people's like savings and stuff being wiped out?
The timing on people's savings.
So specifically millennials. So like when these crises happened, as they should have been getting, as this group of people should have been building up some sort of, you know, stability or wealth, stuff came in and take the economy, crashed your, you know, retirement accounts. And sure, it builds back up over the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, but that's lost progress. So all of that just gets back to where you were, and now it's wasted time. Whereas maybe our parents who just threw whatever in the 401k, and then by the time they hit retirement age, they were golden. Millennials are not having that same experience because of all of the constant spikes and crashes in the economy. That has to have a factor in not appreciating capitalism and leaning more towards communism, because at least from that perspective, capitalism is unstable, communism is more stable. I want something that's more stable because this thing I've been sold is not serving me.
Yeah, so let's look at that now. So what you're talking about is the .com bubble, the 2008 housing bubble, the pandemic right now. And I think a lot of this comes from poor fiscal policy. And And I say fiscal to differentiate from economic policy. And what I mean by that is fiscally, our policy is it's okay to be in debt. People go in debt a lot. Well, that's fine until shit goes sideways. Because if everybody loses their job, like this disease has caused, then, well, you can't pay your debts. And so that means that whoever lent you that debt also really lost their ass.
So it's dominoes.
And so it's a domino effect. And what happens is all of this debt creates bubbles. And that's what you see blow up. Times are good because we're living beyond our means, technically. It doesn't really feel like it because everybody's living beyond their means.
I finally understand the bubble analogy now. Thanks for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So once that pops, though, a disease comes in and everybody loses their job, the domino effect happens, and that's the bubble popping.
Yeah.
Okay. And so what happens is if you have poor fiscal policy, not so much economics, but fiscally, you're not saving, then you can't endure this issue. So what happens? Well, immediately, what did our government do? They started giving people $600 week-to-week unemployment checks, right? On top of the normal unemployment.
Normal stuff, yeah. And then the fat one-time checks too.
The $1,200. Yeah, so that's a lot of money. And so you have to start looking now at the economics, because if people aren't fiscally conservative, then the economic policy has to figure out a way to do that. And so it's like, well, how does the government pay for it? Because we know that the government doesn't have money technically. It can tax people to get money. It can borrow money, which is what bonds are. Just for anybody listening, if I look at a U.S. bond note, I might purchase it, and the contract there is, hey, in 20 years, I'll get a 4% return on my initial investment. If I bought a $1 bond note, then 20 years from now, I'll get $1.04 back.
Makes sense.
And, foreign investors can purchase bonds. So that's two. So we've got taxes, bonds or loans, and inflation, printing money. So those are the only three things that I know of that the government can use to afford to pay things. And I already forgot where we were going with this. Oh, so the $600 checks. Yes. Those are coming from the government. How does the government get that money? They might look to the wealthy and say, we're going to take some of your money there. That means that Google might not be able to afford to pay for a new university program. Obviously very hypothetical, but you can see how it may negatively impact the broader
and it trickles down
society. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, there's a whole conversation there to be had. What's the right way to go? And it's a balance that we ultimately, as a country and a society, have to figure out.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's, I think we said at the beginning, like there's not just, let's, dig a little bit and here's the root of the problem. It's just one. It's like a whole web. Like there's so many different things, and I think that's why you see such that rallying cry of we want something different, because each one of these different aspects, you don't have to hit them all. You don't have to experience them all, but all you have to do is hit one to go, this didn't work for me. And so if there's, how many things have we talked about today? 3, 4 different things all causing people to come to the same conclusion. That's why I think it makes sense. We see this wide swath of everyone saying, hey, let's lean more towards communistic or socialistic tendencies.
I think so too. And in an attempt at being fair and balanced, because I know that I do have a bias,
sure,
and I imagine that you do as well, especially growing up in America. Let's play that out with the communistic culture.
What do you mean?
Let's give a communistic society that same dilemma. Hey, you're in debt as a country, and there's a massive disease that causes everybody to not be able to work for 6 months a year. We don't even know. It's not done. Nowhere close to being done, especially if you're in the United States.
Right.
And How do you handle that? How would you handle that, knowing that everybody's got to have equal outcomes?
I mean, I guess it probably goes back to that same three. Well, I guess maybe not. Because if they own or partially own or have some version of interest in all the companies as well, that's another income stream, right? So it's almost like...
Well, it's an income stream if people are able to buy goods and services from those companies.
Well, right. But I'm saying compared to like our capitalistic thing where that's not even a possibility of an income stream. Where you listed out those three ways, now that's also a fourth way.
You're talking about the three ways being taxes, loans, and printing of money, i.e.
Right.
We'll call it inflation because that's what it does.
Right. So in a communist society, they would have those three options as well as they also can tap into the income of the current companies and basically the economy itself.
I see. So if you're looking at Facebook, and kind of one of the narratives here is that Facebook is massive. They've got billions of dollars.
Sure.
We can tap into that. And I think you're right. I think you can. But let's look at it. You know, China's got 1.4 billion people, but let's look at the United States with 300 million. The policy that we enacted cost $3 trillion.
It's a lot of money.
Apple, the biggest company in the entire world, is valuated just over $1 trillion. They hit $1 trillion valuation last year. So I can't imagine that they're much higher than that.
Right.
Maybe 1.1, 1.2. Well, all right, then you've got to look at like, well, we're in bed with a lot of different companies. So maybe you could scrounge up $3 trillion, but here's where I would argue against that being a viable solution. Amazon, people say Jeff Bezos has like, what is it, like $500 billion or something? I don't know what the number is. A ridiculous amount.
Yeah.
More than anybody needs for the next
they're like,
2,000
Why
generations.
doesn't Jeff Bezos solve world hunger? And I'm like, bro, it's not all cash.
and so that's it. Like, they don't just have... Jeff Bezos doesn't have $500 billion just sitting in a bank account that he can go pull out. No, he's worth $500 billion because he owns stock in his company, Amazon. Little bit of background. Amazon decided to go public. That means that they offer up slices of their company to shareholders to purchase. And so that means that if Jeff Bezos wants to still own his company, he has to own at least 51% of those shares. Otherwise, he risks not being the owner of the company.
Right.
So he's got 51% of Amazon, and that's worth $500 billion or whatever it extrapolates out to.
Right.
So still, that communistic country can't go and say, I'm going to take the amount of money necessary to prop up the economy to the tune of $600 on top of your unemployment check each week.
Yeah, I don't know.
So I think ultimately they're still limited to the same three.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying that they have. I mean, those companies still have some sort of a cash flow, though.
They do, and a lot.
Right, and so I think that you still have access to those streams, which would still be a fourth option, even if it's not as big as the other three. If that makes sense.
So I don't, this is where, you know, there would be a ton of research involved here.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm going out on a hunch, and let's say that those companies have 10% of their valuation as liquid cash.
Sure, it's a good random number.
I don't know. So let's say Apple's valued at 1.2 trillion. So that means that they've got 120 billion liquid
Sitting in
cash.
Yeah.
Amazon's got 100 billion. Let's add all of this up, and maybe you come to $3 trillion. And then you've exhausted all of the capital from all of those companies. That's a lot to get to $3 trillion.
Well, right. And I'm not saying you take it all from one stream. I'm just saying having another stream means it's another place you can pull some from.
Yes. Yeah. And then you can get some.
And then it's not it might not be as impactful to one channel if you can spread it across 2, 3, 4.
So, yeah. Okay. So I see what you're saying. So you use all 4 policies and you diversify that. Yep.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So then that way it's not as huge of a hit in any specific spot.
So that'd be very helpful if you could do that. Yep. Makes sense. So ultimately though, what you'll see is that the bill has to be paid by somebody. And then how does you know, if you're in that situation, how do you determine which companies we are going to actually pull money from versus the ones that we're not? Maybe it's just unilaterally across the board.
Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe you set a threshold. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think it's interesting to just kind of see where that plays out. But yeah, I think that would be a potentially viable solution, and it's just dividing it all. So
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What haven't we covered?
We talked a lot about inflation, but I did want to note just one note here. And I actually just kind of wrote it down because it was just thoughts in my head.
Sure.
But it's the idea that we talked about how printing money inherently causes inflation at some point. And there's a concept here that is, whenever we experience inflation, it causes the class divide to get wider. So we hear that a lot, like the divide in classes. You've got a wealthy class and a poor class, and then you've got a middle class, which seems like it's shrinking because it's dividing more and more. So what we see is that inflation causes the divide between the rich and poor to grow because, well, what happens with inflation? Let's think about that. Well, prices rise because the purchasing power of the dollar decreases. So let's just use an example. If we see a 50% inflation in the dollar, that would be really high.
Yeah.
Really, really high. But let's say, just for argument's sake, that that's the case. Well, then your $3 gallon of milk is going to be 50% more expensive. So it's going to be $4.50 because the value of the dollar lost value.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, that same concept applies to other assets like business or housing, stocks. So inherently what you're going to see if you just track that concept of inflation down this path, you're going to see the cost of housing rising. Well, that sounds familiar, right?
No. No, it doesn't. What are you talking about, Nick?
So you see the cost of housing rise and all these different goods and services rise in price. And now only the people who were already wealthy can afford to buy houses.
That's a good point.
And well, what happens when they can buy houses? They can go buy up the rest of the houses and they can charge rent, and it kind of gets into that concept of a monopoly.
Yeah.
Like if I noticed that when this Airbnb trend kicked off, a lot of people went and bought houses around Nashville. We were having a huge housing housing market expansion, you might say, or bubble, you might say.
Sure.
I don't want to call it a bubble because it might not be. But people would, from California or around the world, buy houses in Nashville to rent them out as Airbnbs. And what did that do? Well, that jacked the prices of houses up. And I was trying to buy a house at that time, and it was difficult. Like my dad has quite a bit bigger house. I wouldn't say quite a bit, but he's got some land with it. It's closer to Nashville, and he's only lived there for 10 years or so, but he paid less for his house that came with 3 acres of land and is a bigger house in a better location than I paid for my house.
With less land and less actual house.
Right. And
it's crazy.
So a lot of that, it's even more exacerbated by being around Nashville. But
yeah, because place is exploding right now.
You can see where that problem happens. So for a lot of millennials, we're seeing this widening gap between the wealthy and the poor. All the while, our wages are staying pretty much the same. They're staying relatively stagnant.
So the game's getting harder.
Yeah.
Without
odds are
any
stacked against us.
Yeah, without any perks. And so if you get, I don't know, lucky is not the right word, but there's some luck involved to it, I think. So
there can be.
Yeah. So I think if you get lucky enough or happen to have someone who knows how to play the game and can help you navigate, you can make it through. But if you don't know that the system isn't what it was, and you try to just follow the, roadmap that culture gives us blindly, you're probably not going to make it.
Right. And so that there kind of goes back to like our education system. Wouldn't it be nice if our education system taught us how to play the game?
Sure.
Instead of the 2 years that you spend. When I did my first 2 years of college, I haven't graduated yet. I actually just started going back to school, for matter of fact. But the first 2 years, I was like, I'm taking algebra in college. I took that in high school. Why am I not compounding on my learning? Why am I redoing this?
Right. And it's because it kind of goes back to that. Oh, well, the government's going to guarantee our money. So let's make a bunch of bullshit that's required into our certification. So that way we can milk our audience for more profit.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's a broken system ultimately. Sure. And one that, again, I would argue is not capitalism. Yeah. And so I think we're putting the blame in the wrong place. And so millennials, generally speaking, might be blaming the wealth divide as the problem instead of blaming the underlying economic issues as the problem. Those economic issues being $3 trillion spent just a couple months ago. We're talking about spending another, I heard $2 trillion.
Again, yeah.
800 billion or 700 billion, whatever it was in 2008, and so on. This crazy government spending and inflationary policy or inflationary effects furthers that wealth divide.
Yeah. And then I think, allowing, companies like Wells Fargo and, the other banks that really, screwed the pooch on that to just be like, oh, well, here you go. And I know they got more restrictions and stuff, but still, like they're still off being huge, and
those 6 banks got $800 billion.
Yeah.
Like it's crazy.
In my mind, like if you think about this, you take any type of ethical whatever out of it and go, all right, so that's how you make $800 million. You go get big enough and fail, and the government's just going to pay you. That was a bonus.
Mm-hmm. Same with like Ford and GM. I haven't researched the situation there, but they got subsidized. And so that meant that a lot of people got to stay in business. And fortunately, Ford at least has flipped their business around. So maybe that was a good situation, but still somebody's got to pay for that.
Right.
And so that might have been an actual good move, a good regulatory move. It might not have been. Again, I'm uneducated on that specific topic.
But without that money coming back, right? That money's got to be accounted for, I think is what we're getting at. And so maybe it was hey, cool. You're too big to fail, but you're paying this shit back.
Yes.
Right.
Whether it's going to be
through the next 100 years, because that's a chunk of change and we don't need to cripple you. We need you to keep going. But you're going to do it better, and you got to pay this back to us, but we'll front it for now. But so that way we don't screw the economy with inflation, like, hey, you're going to pay this back. And maybe that is what's going on, but I don't know if that is or not.
Let me also throw this concept at you.
Let's do it.
If you are in debt, inflation is beneficial. Think about it.
Explain.
If I purchased my house for $250,000 and I went in debt to do that, I'm $250,000 in debt. But inflation does what? It causes the price of goods and services to go up because the value of your dollar is worth less.
Sure.
So now my house is worth $400,000. I can sell my house, be completely out of debt, and have the other $150,000 as profit. Inflation helps people who are in debt. And who's in debt? People who are wealthy actually tend to be in debt because they've taken risk to...
And they've got enough capital at least to start to back it up. And so then they get these big loans to make more money. And yeah.
Right. And
so there is some type of incentivization for inflation, but you got to be careful with it because too much and it all comes crashing.
Right. Because eventually the value of your dollar just falls apart.
Yep.
But it just reinforces the wealth divide.
Yeah.
Because if you're impoverished, you can't afford to buy wealth. You might be taking out debt to maintain yourself instead of taking out debt to purchase an asset.
Yeah.
And so that furthers that divide. Well, apply that to the United States, who's like $27 trillion in debt. We can find out pretty easily, but we're in the ballpark there.
Yeah, a lot.
Well, what might we do? We might, to solve this problem, because I don't think that we can tax the people enough to raise that kind of money and pay off our debt. So what might we do? We might inflate the hell out of the dollar so that we can pay off our debt. And that means that anybody who's buying bonds is only going to get a 4% return, but if the value of the dollar is inflated drastically to where you've lost 50% of your value, well, buying that 20-year bond note doesn't make sense. I'm going to go look and invest in a different country.
So how do you we know you print money, right?
Yeah.
Is it just the opposite? You take money out of circulation to lower inflation?
Yeah, I suppose you could start destroying some of the money supply, but remember that the government does this electronically. So yeah,
right.
They would buy up, actually, I think this is where you start having bonds. I may be talking on my ass a little bit again.
That's okay. Cause I'm just thinking through the strategy, right? Like we increase inflation to fix the debt, but once the debt's paid off, now we have an inflation problem. How do we fix that and get things to stable?
Yes, I'm sorry. It is the bonds. You start buying back those bonds.
Got it.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, because now we own it, not someone else. It's not the debt. Got it.
Right. So you start buying back those bonds. Yeah. So that's what happens. That's how you destroy money.
Interesting.
Figuratively.
Way above my pay grade.
Well, mine too. I just get nerdy. And
I mean, no,
it's
cool to talk about, but I'm so glad I'm not in charge of it. That's, I guess, what I'm getting at.
So all of this combined, you see housing prices go up.
Yeah.
You see crony capitalism at the highest levels. You see people becoming more and more impoverished as the wealthy get more and more wealthy. We don't really scrutinize the actual policies like what happened with 2008 and where that money went, and understanding that wasn't actually capitalism. And we also talked about how it can take a long time to innovate. It took, like I said, 1965 is when government started subsidizing student loans, and here it is now. Google has, to my knowledge, become the first competitor to this.
In 2020, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to give time in there for it to ramp up to be a big enough problem, but still.
So there's a lot of reasons why I think people are looking at communism as a potential solution, or maybe it's better to frame this up as why millennials are shying away from capitalism.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know of any other system and framework, maybe you do, but it's capitalism and communism for the most part, right?
Or more generally speaking, socialism.
Socialism, right.
Yeah.
And so people are like, hey, this doesn't work. Well, here's the only other option. This is better because this doesn't work. Not necessarily contrasting and trying to create something that does work.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Got it. Makes sense. So what was your biggest takeaway?
Well, I didn't really have a summary in mind. Well, I did have some aha moments throughout this conversation. Like what I really liked was your point about if you're a communistic society, you can choose to take money from some of the government, corporation entities. I don't know what else to call that.
Yeah.
Conglomerations. But anyway, you have kind of like a fourth option to manage fiscal and economic policy. But for me, this wasn't exactly an outline. I didn't have like a takeaway to lay out. But as we were talking, knowing that I wanted to have like a summary, I realized that it was the long time to innovate on major issues. Like we talked about oil, or the reference that we just made about education.
Yeah.
It's blaming the wrong policies, like not understanding that things weren't capitalism. Those two things, I think, really made me realize the root of why millennials are starting to blame communism. I didn't have that. That wasn't my conclusion going into this.
Sure. Yeah. I think the coolest thing that I discovered in this conversation was that, because my mind always thinks about solutions, right? And thinking about proactively creating solutions so we don't necessarily have problems, right? So fixing problems before they're there, and realizing that might not even be, it's making me challenge my own perspective. Because when we came to the realization that these problems, at least that we were talking about here in like capitalism, create a breeding ground for solutions. Mm-hmm. So sometimes problems aren't necessarily problems. They're opportunities for solutions. And I know that's kind of cheesy to say, but like looking at it and experiencing it that way of like, no, the bigger the problem, And the longer it goes on and the more stress that's there, it's like you're squeezing a solution out of that space.
The better the reward.
Yeah. That was kind of my big aha moment that's going to make me think differently about bullshit I encounter.
Yeah, that was another great one that I hadn't thought about until, we did that thought experiment. Like, well, what happens with food? What happens with oil?
Right.
So yeah, I think that was a really good way to just wrap this one up. And I'm curious to hear what other people think and what we missed. I mean, like you can tear this apart and peel back the layers in so many different directions. And, again, I don't claim that this is anywhere close to being all encompassing. So I know that there are other opinions and probably some things that we didn't consider when we were talking about our potential solutions here. So I'm curious to hear what other people think. But one of the things I want to mention this right here at the end in closing, you had asked or said maybe something about why things take so long to happen, or no, I'm sorry. It's why we look at the short-term gain instead of the long-term gain. And it might be because of, let's use this tuition issue as an example. If we're looking at 50 years to come up with a problem, that's pretty much an entire generation. So,
well, if you think about it, it probably didn't go, from reasonable to astronomical overnight. Right. It was all of these 1% changes, 5% change. Well, we can make 5% more this year. Well, you do that over a period of 20 years, 5%, boom, you just increase something 100%.
Yeah, right? It's like that compound interest concept.
Yep. And so it's like, holy shit, that's probably how some of these things happen. And so it's short-term thinking and what can we do this year? What little more can we squeeze out instead of thinking, how do we make this sustainable?
So I think maybe generally speaking, we just need to trust that somebody will have the ingenuity and the motivation to solve that problem because they'll figure out that they can, it benefits them.
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of have this like big 10,000 foot view picture of almost like an ecosystem. And if you're super hyper focused going, here's a problem, it does look crazy. But when you zoom out, oh, that's just going to get, it's almost big enough for someone to come in and solve it.
Right.
If you look at it from a big like ecosystem standpoint, it's not as scary as it seems.
Right.
Which is kind of, refreshing.
Yeah. This was awesome. I really enjoyed going through this.
Same.
I would like to do something similar and hear more details on communism. And somebody who might live in Hong Kong where they're moving from the very westernized society to just abrupt integration with mainland China. And I'd be curious to see if somebody like that understands the ins and outs of communism a little bit better, to hear what the pros beyond what we've discussed are.
Yeah, I agree. Someone with firsthand experience, not our hypothetical experience.
Right, certainly. So awesome. Well, if you made it this far, thanks for listening.
100%.
Thought this was an awesome conversation. I learned a lot, Tony. Thanks for asking some good questions and giving me some new perspectives as well. Looking forward to the next one.
Indeed. That's a wrap.